Well, Emily, welcome and congratulations on Field Studies. Your first full-length LP, is that correct?
That's correct. So I've had my music on several other albums, but this is my first entirely my recording project.
Well, that's wonderful. That title suggests a kind of documentation of something, Field Studies. Is that accurate?
I would say so. I was quite influenced growing up and still by all the naturalist field guides. And then there's a number of books in the past few years who have come out sort of relating to the idea of field studies or being out in the natural world or the field in the same way. So I certainly drew inspiration, or there's resonance there.
It also reminded me of field recordings, which seem to be everywhere these days. And it got me wondering if there's a naturalist aspect to any of these compositions.
Well, I think, well, I don't really do much field recording myself. It's something I certainly learned about and have an appreciation for, and I think a lot of Canadian composers feel very close to that tradition, even if it's not something they actively practice themselves. But as I was saying previously, there is that really sort of close connection with the natural world, and there's certainly, even the titles are of each individual piece are sort of evocative of
Mm.
specific landscapes that I'm exploring, perhaps in a more sonic or textural way, but there is that link there.
It's true of many Canadian artists in multiple mediums, isn't it? I mean, it's seems to be in our blood. Is it something that you consciously want to communicate, or does it just kind of come out in the work?
think I think it's always just been there, if that makes sense. But I've also thought about it in terms of landscape of Canada and structure, and something I've noticed and other people have commented on, that Canadian composers have a very different sense of expansiveness and structure in their work. And perhaps it's because we live in on such a large landmass, and that our sense of space and timing is just different because there's so much of it in this country and we're so spread out.
You've experienced that firsthand. You was just saying, having grown up in Toronto, which
Mhm.
is one of those major cities with a lot of density, to Edmonton, where certainly a big city, but not nearly as dense. So you're probably feeling that pretty directly right now.
Definitely. And I actually, in between living in Toronto and Edmonton, I lived in Montana for 3 years. So I went from big city Toronto to small mountain town in a state where there's one area code for the phone system for the entire state, because there's so much landmass and so few people. So that was quite a culture shock, not just moving countries, but also, as you're saying, that difference between living kind of shoulder to shoulder with everyone and then having a lot more space. And then Edmonton actually sort of feels like the happy medium between the two now. So the move here, I was really happy to be back in Canada, still living in a city with some of the culture and amenities of the city, but not quite as fast paced and busy and congested. But I certainly also miss that aspect of Toronto. It's nice to
Mhm.
kind of be lost in that sometimes.
Well, it's good to hear. Edmonton's a wonderful spot. There's a great line on your website describing your work. I'm going to read it here. Primarily concerned with textural landscapes, resonance, and variances in color. Beautifully written, but I'm wondering if you can elaborate for us a little bit on that. What do you want us to understand about your work?
That's a great question, and always a really difficult one to answer, because in fact, I think for me, most of the time, I don't want to tell people how to feel or what to experience in my music. Um, that's up to the individual and how they're feeling that day, what space they're in, perhaps what they ate for breakfast, if they went for a walk. Um, so I want to leave space open for people to experience what they're experiencing sonically, and make their own story or draw their own conclusions from the music. But one of the things we're often asked as composers is, what kind of music do you write, or what does your music sound like? And so I've had to come up with ways to describe my music um, that kind of touch on the fact that maybe my music isn't primarily driven by harmony or melody or some of the things we're used to hearing in a very specific way in some of the historical repertoire. So using that terminology has sort of allowed me to talk about how I maybe think about sound and how I approach sound in like a more visual or tactile way, if we're talking about color or texture, or again, that idea of landscape and space. But also by saying those three things, I'm also saying, you're not going to hear a big 5-to-1 cadence typically at the end of my piece, or some of the things like an audience listening to a Beethoven symphony, we're used to hearing things in a certain way, and that gives us signals about where we are in the piece and the structure. And I'm quite consciously avoiding some of that or reconsidering it. And so when I'm starting a piece, I'm usually focusing in on what sort of color choices I want, what sort of story I want to tell sonically, what sort of textures can you get out of the instruments, out of the electronics. So just thinking about structuring the music and like the sonic palette in a slightly different way from the historical repertoire of the tradition I draw from.
Well, let me tell you my impression of field studies because it's a strong one. Um, Sparse without being minimalist, and a kind of searching. There's a kind of contemplative nature to all of the pieces on here that I found really, really compelling. How does that feel?
I'd say quite nice. That's a nice way to think about it. And someone might also feel quite impatient, you know, uh, because I do recognize it's a slower pace, and things unfold or evolve in a way that's not sort of fast or immediate. But I'm hoping, through that, I'm opening a space for contemplation. So um, I think that's quite a nice way of describing it or experiencing it.
And wonderful performances. Can you tell us who's on this album?
Absolutely. So it's a mixture of old friends and new friends. There's 3 tracks on the album that feature artists here in Edmonton. So Ultraviolet Ensemble is a local ensemble here, and that features Roger Admiral on piano, Mark Seger on percussion, Alison Belchetis on saxophone, and Shanoa Anderson on flutes. So they are sort of the foundation of the album. There's a duo featuring just the woodwinds. There's a one piece that's a quartet, and then there's an additional piece where they're joined by Jane Berry, who's a vocalist here. So that's 3 tracks, and then those are bookended by 2 solo works for colleagues and collaborators that I worked with in Toronto over the years. Both of them are affiliated with Thin Edge New Music Collective, but also brilliant soloists and artists in their own right. So the opening track is Cheryl Duval playing piano, and she also plays harmonica on that track. So she was a good sport about tackling learning a bit of harmonica on top of doing what she normally does, which is play piano. And then the final track on the album is featuring Ilana Waniak on violin, and she does a beautiful job of interpreting a landscape where I'm dealing with microtonality in the violin, and some quite challenging things for me to sort out as a composer, but also as a performer. It's quite a demanding piece. And so she's been really lovely to work with getting that ready as well. They've all been lovely and great sports and wonderful collaborators.
Oh, it's great to hear. In addition to solo works and chamber groups, you have composed for full orchestras.
Mhm.
Always curious about the compositional process and how instrumentation decisions are made, and at what point do you know it's a solo piece versus a quartet piece, or how does that happen for you?
Um, Quite honestly, it's often very sort of practical or pragmatic, in that most often I'm approached by an ensemble or an individual, and I'm commissioned as a composer to write a piece for them. So, for instance, the piece for Cheryl, she had a project a few years ago where she was commissioning a number of Canadian composers to write her solo pieces. So then it's there's the exciting part of that, talking about what that might sound like and their artistic considerations, but there's also some very practical things like how long is the piece going to be, what's it going to be for, when is it going to be premiered, and that often shapes a lot of those decisions before you even sit down to think much about what would happen sonically. Whereas, when I write for orchestra, that's, for instance, the Toronto Symphony approaching me and commissioning me. And then again, we'd like an 8-minute piece. We have these forces available in the orchestra, or these other pieces are being performed that night. So here are the people who are available. Um, so a lot of that's very prescriptive in a way. But I will say the other three pieces on the album came about a bit of a different way because I wanted to write and work with these new colleagues and friends in Edmonton. So I was actually the one who kind of approached them, knowing them a little bit, becoming friends with them, and then that was more of a conversation of, oh, I'd like to write some music to go on this album. What sort of piece would work well for you as an ensemble when you go out and do concerts, if you take this piece with you, and here's what I'd like to include on the album. So that was a little bit of a not so typical conversation, whereas usually it's a commissioner approaching me. This was a bit more kind of back and forth, which was actually really lovely because I think we've ended up with a piece that works well on the album, and then they're going to be able to perform it in a number of situations in the next year.
That's great. When a commission comes to you, do you tend to start blank page, or are there ideas floating in your mind at any given time that you just see an opportunity to execute on?
Oh, that's a great question too. Again, I think it depends. Sometimes there's lots of ideas percolating, and the opportunity comes forward and I go, "Oh, great. This is a chance to try this out." Other times I have to go kind of search out inspiration or ideas, and spend a few months really just thinking about something before I sit down and start to shape materials. Um, I'm just trying to think of some examples. Well, the first piece I wrote for the Toronto Symphony when I was working with them, all the materials came out of a very long car drive from Montana to Toronto that summer, and then Toronto to Edmonton. So I spent a lot of time in the car driving through a lot of different landscapes. And so by the time I sat down to write the piece, I felt like I had all the materials just from
Hmm.
having been in motion a lot that summer and seen a lot of different things. Whereas, sometimes when it's been a long winter and you've been at home a lot, like right now, where things are just starting to warm up in Edmonton, and maybe I haven't been out doing quite as much, or I've been grading lots of school assignments and kind of, had my brain in other sort of aspects of my life, then I really need to go search out some new ideas, or go for a long camping trip or a hike, or go walk through the museum. All sorts of different things can help sort of propel that forward. But it just really depends on where I'm at in the year and my headspace and how many projects I've been working on.
Hmm. How long have you been teaching, and how do you enjoy it?
Oh, well, I've been teaching in Edmonton now. This is I guess I've been here about 4 years. And then previous to that, I spent 3 years in Montana teaching. So I guess I've been at it, excuse me, for about 7 years full time. Um, and I do love it. I learn so much from my students, and I really enjoy being around that energy and excitement of young musicians who are excited to be, just starting their careers and learning more. But it's often a balancing act too, because it's also a demanding job, and I have to be careful about my time, so that I do have time to devote to my writing and to other aspects of my life. So it's a bit of a balancing act, but I feel very fortunate. I get to do two things that I really enjoy, and it's afforded me um, a little more flexibility with the teaching to sort of choose which commissioning projects I want to work on. Whereas when you're younger, you kind of say yes to everything, because you're trying to gain experience and make enough to pay rent and eat and all of that as well. All the practical things we have to think about.
I can imagine having to balance not just time, but energy. Um,
Definitely.
Composing must be an exhausting process. Is that true?
Um, I don't know if I would describe it as exhausting, but it's very all encompassing, and you spend a lot of time in your own head by yourself. And so I think by virtue of what we do, it tends to attract introverts or people who are very comfortable with being on their own. And so one of the things I've found about teaching, in contrast, is it's very much like a performance, being up in front of a classroom, in front of students. And so I often feel quite tired, not in a bad way, but it takes a lot of energy to do the teaching aspect of things. And so it's always sort of this balancing act of um, having enough energy to sit down and not feel exhausted when you go to do your creative work, because your creative work doesn't really, nothing good really happens when you're exhausted, right? um, so there's always that balancing act of um, of sort of energy. But I think it goes the other way too. You can spend a lot of time in a room by yourself, which I'm quite good at, but sometimes it's good, again, to sort of poke your head out and go to some concerts and see other people and be involved in the community. And so there's always that balance of too much time alone or too much time with people, and how that kind of impacts your energy and your headspace to do both your jobs well.
You're not just a teacher of music, you're a teacher of creativity and the creative process.
Mhm.
Um, Tips for us, our mortals who don't write music for a living?
I sort of joke. I think a lot of what I end up teaching to young musicians isn't just sort of like the craft, like the theory or how you compose, but it's a lot of it's managing our time. And I think the thing that is the hardest for people is carving out time or a habit or a routine to do that work. And when you start talking to composers who have been doing this for a while, I think the ones who are kind of successful, whatever that means to them, because success can mean very different things, whether it's having time to write a piece, or if you want to be doing 10 commissions a year, whatever that is for you. The composers who seem happiest are the ones who are good at managing their time in a way where they carve out time on a regular basis that kind of becomes a habit or a routine for their artistic practice. And I think what's hard is it's very easy to always push that stuff to the lowest thing on your to-do list. And even for students, they're taking many classes and they have part-time jobs and all sorts of other demands on their time. And then they have to find time to sit down and focus their creative energies. And so I don't know if this is advice, but just an acknowledgement that it's hard for all of us to sort of carve out that time, make space, and we really have to be protective of that space that we make. Whether it's we get up at 5 in the morning and spend an hour every morning before we look at emails and all the other things, or whether you carve out some time in the evening, or however you decide to do it, you have to be protective and really learn how to manage your time and your energy.
It's true in the context of any profession, isn't it? That the creative side of what you do deserves to be, the process deserves to be respected. And you've got to be conscious of how you spend your time and energy on on those creative aspects.
Definitely. And so much of our work is about the process. If we think about it, most of our days are spent immersed in that, not the product. If I look at a month of my life, most of it is that, not going to concerts and rehearsals, and or in the case of this album, editing with the audio engineer and all the sort of other things that come towards the end of putting something out. But so much of what we do is working through our ideas, until we find something we're happy with, and then it goes out in the world. But it's a small fraction of what we do for most days.
Thanks for this, Emily, very much.